John is the Senior Resident Fellow and the J. Ronald Terwilliger Chair for Housing for the Urban Land Institute. John brings more than 35 years of experience in the fields of housing investment, and the development of sustainable housing. And as the Senior Resident Fellow for Housing at ULI, John is responsible for ULI's research efforts to seek and promote affordable housing solutions. John, thank you for making it down from New York. Please welcome John.
First, I should let you know I need a little help here. This is the first time I've done this on one eye. One of the things you get to do when you get to be of a certain age is you get to have cataract surgery. And cataract surgery, as it turns out, is a miracle these days, not like it was when I was growing up. So I, on Monday, had my left eye done so I can see all of you. I have 20/20 vision. I used to have on this eye, I still have 2200 vision, which is almost legally blind. So I'm going to be going back and forth, and it's a very interesting experience, so please bear with me. I also would like to say that I too have roots in Philadelphia. My father grew up in Philadelphia, his family grew up in Philadelphia, and we spent my teenage years living in Philadelphia. This was a long time ago. It was a different Philadelphia than you have now. And I also saw it through teenager eyes, which are obviously, as you know, quite different. So I do remember we lived out in Paoli, and I went downtown, but there was nothing to do downtown, so unless there was, why do you go downtown? So it's really remarkable to come back and see the vibrancy of the city. And where I live now, however, I would say, with all due respect to my good friend Chris, is the #1 hottest city in the United States. It's called Brooklyn. And it is a wonderful place to live. I don't know what our walk score is, but it's got to be 100. Everything we want is in 4 blocks, and they're great little places, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I won't bore you with all of that. But so what I'd like to do is make a few comments on Chris's outstanding presentation. Thank you, Chris. It's really very, I found it very interesting and very helpful. But I have some thoughts on it, of course. And then I'd like to comment on a few things that have happened over the last 10 days that I think have an impact on the issues of smart growth that we're all involved in. So I would caution a little bit on what Chris says about walkable urban being the market. I agree completely that there is a secular long-term shift that is in the process of occurring. This century is the urban century for the United States. The last century was a suburban century. And we are, in fact, moving that way, but it's at the margins. The margins are very significant when they're as big as they are in this country. But there's still going to be suburban and ex-urban development for a host of reasons, because we're still adding 2.5 million people to the country every year. We should be adding 1.5 million homes a year, and we haven't been. We've been adding anywhere from 500,000 to 600,000. There's a huge pent-up demand, and as you all know, if you're urban developers, there's no way we can build that much new housing in the urban, even the suburban areas at this point, given the resistance, given the lack of sites, et cetera, the regulatory barriers, et cetera, and the higher costs. And cost is going to become an increasingly important issue in the years ahead, because of the fact that unless you happen to be in the top 1% or the top 5% or in the top 10 or 15%, your wages are actually flat or falling in real dollar terms. And yet the cost of producing housing continues to increase, because actually materials markets are a global market. There's huge demand for materials, and so the cost of producing the housing is going up at the same time as the basic incomes of the market that you're going to be serving are flat or down. So there's going to be a crunch, which is going to force a lot of people to live in less expensive areas. Now, how that's all going to balance out, I don't know, but I still think, so I think Chris's point of how do you bring social equity, how do we have a mix of incomes in these walkable urban areas, is a fundamental policy issue that we all have to face. And the fact of the matter is, there are still a lot of people who want to have a backyard, who want to have a larger home or a larger place, and are willing to drive around in the suburbs. It's not going to be an immediate shift, but the trend is clearly in the direction that Chris is talking about. One of the things that Chris did mention was a lot of the kids, when they get partnered up and have kids, whether they get married or not, that's a whole new issue, are going to want to go to the suburbs because of the schools. Well, yes and no. Suburban schools aren't what they used to be, except in some very expensive suburban neighborhoods. Remember, suburban schools have now anywhere from 20, 30, 40, 50 different languages they have to serve. Kids speaking them in different languages. The immigration has moved to the suburbs. Keep in mind that suburban schools are laying off teachers. They're cutting back. Keep in mind that urban schools have a host of options now with charter schools and others that are actually quite good. So I think there's going to be not the old flow out to the suburbs by Generation Y. I think they're going to split in lots of different ways. And with a good school system, you can keep them in the city, even if it's only in parts, in certain numbers of good schools. So who wants walkable urban communities? First off, I've just finished a booklet that was published by ULI called Housing in America, The Boomers Turn 65. And it really takes a look at the three generations that we have over 65. We have the greatest generation who are 85 and over, and they're very traditional in many ways, except for the fact that they're living a whole lot longer, and they're mostly living in where they have been or in senior housing communities. The next group is late 60s to early 80s, the silent generation. They're a very interesting group because they're actually quite different from the greatest generation, and they're exploring a whole bunch of different options. They're also living longer. They're fairly well off financially compared to prior generations their age. And many of them are moving downtown. They do want to move into there. This is really the people who started the empty nester move downtown trend, which is also very real, although again at the margins, not the majority of them. And then we have the leading edge of the boomers, those who are now in the late 50s, early 60s, who are crossing over the 65 threshold, but are clearly not seniors. You don't ever want to call a 67-year-old or 66-year-old boomer a senior. They will take a senior pass, so they'll do that. By the way, they probably, they don't have to be seniors. They're healthier, they're going to live longer, they've got more energy than any group of 65-year-olds in the history of the planet, really, to be blunt about it. And they are now starting second and third or fourth careers. They're going to continue working, A, because they have to, B, because they want to. And many of them are going to move downtown. They have been moving downtown. They don't have to worry about schools. They don't have to, they've got some money if they can sell their suburban home. This is a group that went out to the suburbs, and many of them are living now in the suburbs. But keep in mind that many of their homes are underwater. They're unable to sell them. Some of them don't want to, but some of them are starting to move. And this is going to be a very interesting group to watch where they move. Are they going to move downtown? Are they going to move to these suburban walkable neighborhoods? Are they going to move to other cities? I was talking to a friend last night who said that she felt she had one more move left in her, so she moved across the country. Why? It's just like another group that I met in New York. They're from San Francisco. Their family's in San Francisco. They're living in New York. Why? They're in their 70s. Well, we've never lived in New York, but we've always loved it, so we thought we'd try living in New York. So this is the kind of experimentation we can expect. And it's an important group to try to capture because they bring a lot of energy, and if they can sell their homes, they can buy some very attractive housing in the cities. Gens Y and Z are very urban. All of the studies show that they're very much, they love being in the cities, and in fact, that's true of most young generations. So they are very much a market question, as we talked about, is do they stay in the city, or do they move out, or where did they move out to the suburban walkable neighborhoods? Gen X is very interesting here because this is a move-up generation. These are people in their late 30s, early 40s, who should be now moving to the next bigger house. They've gotten a promotion, they've got more kids, they need a bigger home, they want a bigger home. And so they're the ones who should be buying the homes of the boomers, the suburban homes of the boomers. But there's an interesting fact we've not had in this country for at least a long time, certainly during the course of the last generation, the last century, which is this is the first time the move-up generation is smaller than the preceding generation. Gen X, there are fewer people in Gen X than there are in the boomers. The leading edge boomers were much bigger than the war babies, the silent generation, and the second half of the boomers were bigger than the first half, so you had to keep building the suburbs. Now we have a smaller group moving out to the suburbs. So no matter what happens, even if people don't want to move to the urban areas, we're not going to have the same demand for suburban housing that we had before. Prices in the suburbs, in most of the suburbs, are going to stay relatively flat under the best of circumstances, recognizing, of course, that whenever you're talking broad generalities, the way I'm talking about markets, it's essentially meaningless because every market is specific. All the local markets are what's going to make a difference. Where Joe lives, he doesn't have to worry about it. It's a great little neighborhood. But there are other places where he was living, perhaps he got out at the right time. So we're just picking on you. You seem to be the whipping boy for today. So what makes a successful urban space? These things don't just happen because some of them do sort of grow up over time and get themselves sorted out. But if you're making a new space, and as Chris pointed out, there are many in the Philadelphia region that are going to have to be created almost out of whole cloth. Taking an intersection or taking a regional mall and rebuilding and then building in the neighborhoods around it. How you do it is a very important design feature, a design function. Too many of our urban spaces are really Potemkin villages. And if you go around to most of the master plan communities, you see these cute little downtowns that are meaningless and have virtually no retail in them. Even some of the great projects like Stapleton, which is a redesign of the old Stapleton Airport in the edge of Denver. It has a downtown. It's hardly a block, it's 2 blocks with a little bit of housing over it. And then across I-70, on the north side of I-70, is the big Stapleton Mall, and right on the other side is the low-rent Stapleton Mall. So that's not urbanism. That's not walkable urbanism. In fact, I don't even think it's successful master plan communities. By the way, at ULI, we've been doing a lot of work looking at what's the future of the master plan community. And the answer is, it's very different from the past. This is the people who are actually building these, the horizontal planners and developers. And they're not going to be building the type of master plan communities that we've seen in the past. There isn't the capacity for it, there isn't the market for it, there isn't the financing for it, there isn't the risk tolerance for it. They're going to be more urban, they're going to be smaller, they're going to be more dense. The challenge is if you're going to build a master plan community with real urbanism, you have to put a lot of money up front into that infrastructure, which increases the risk, makes it harder. So there's a real challenge ahead in terms of the whole suburban design process and suburban development process, which again means there's more opportunity for the kind of urban infill development that is going to be so important in the future. So critical mass, in my view, is the real question, how you build. The real issue here is how you build real urbanism. It's not new urbanism or old urbanism. Both are good, but they have to be real, and that means critical mass. And that means a critical mass of jobs, as well as housing, as well as retail, as well as services, etc. Eds and Ed's clearly very important. Build it around research institutions, build it around major universities and colleges. You have a plethora of those here, as they do in Washington, D.C., as we do in New York. Connectivity, transit, very important. The whole car issue, as Chris pointed out, is increasingly important. The Generation Y is not aren't car lovers the way my generation was. I couldn't wait to get my license when I was 16. And but my son, who was Gen X actually, waited 3 years. We were living in Washington, D.C. He waited to get his license. I couldn't understand. I thought that he had some kind of deformity or maybe he needed drugs or something like that to be able to recognize he could have that freedom. But now, a lot of the Gen Ys aren't interested in driving, understandably. And they also are beginning to understand the cost equation that Chris mentioned. So, transit connectivity, very important. Fundamental, the blocking and tackling of urbanism is very important too, and that starts with safety. It has to be a safe environment. It has to be a clean environment and a safe environment. Design. Design is very important. Clearly, compact is important. People will walk maybe about at the most, a quarter to half a mile. If it's really important, they'll walk. That's about 10 minutes. 5 to 10 minutes is what you're looking at. That's our neighborhood in Brooklyn, by the way. Everything is in 5 to 10 minutes. My wife walks to the Y, that's about a 12-minute walk. I don't understand why she does that. She actually, we could take the subway one stop, but she thinks it's good for her health. So how you bring everything together is important, and that of course means that the relationship of height to spaciousness is important. I grew up in Manhattan, so I happen to think that that's the way the world should be. I always think of Philadelphia now as getting there. Washington, D.C. is far too low. There's much too much sky. Sky is much overrated. And there needs to be a sense of authenticity, a sense of place. Now, how do you build in a new environment a sense of authenticity? Well, you give it its own identity. And every place can have an identity, and frequently there's some kind of historical thing you can play with, but it has to be done with a sensitivity. It can't be just Disney or Disneyfied. And ultimately, it takes time. Only time can really give a place authenticity. It's got to have some peeling paint. It's got to have a little scruffiness to it. It can't all be too clean and whatnot. So building in layers, and thinking about when you're building, don't think about what we're building today. Think about phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Plan phase 1 so that 2, 3, 4, and 5 can be layered in to add to the compactness and add to the design and add to the authenticity. Public spaces, third places, very, very important, both inside and outside. Where do people get together? My view is, well, we're talking amongst the master plan community people, golf courses are out. Nobody wants, there are too many golf courses out there already. And what people want are walking trails, hiking trails, bike trails, get out into nature, things like that. But they also want walkable. What is really the core amenity in walkable? What is the new amenity that people are really looking for when you're thinking about walkable urban? Why do people want to move to walkable urban? The new amenity is people. The new amenity is seeing your fellow citizens, walking past them, seeing people who are tall and short and green and brown and white and blue and old and young, rich and poor, and going to the stores together, being part of the community, the neighborhood. People are hungry for community. Important as the internet is in creating virtual community, people also want real community. They may not want to talk to all of these people. They may not want to even, they may be even a little nervous about them, but they really value having other people around. So third places, whether it's parks or libraries are reinventing themselves, but still very, very important places. And all of the other kinds of, whether it's a coffee shop, a Starbucks, things like that. And Starbucks was really smart in recognizing that what they're really creating, their business is third places. Creating places for people to hang out together in an informal, inexpensive way. Appropriate street-level retail. Now this is, I have to defer to Margaret McCauley here. We had a wonderful conversation about it. She's an expert in creating retail. And the way you start off with thinking about creating retail in a walkable urban place is think of it as if you were a mall developer. Mall developers choose who they bring in, who they invite in. They don't just open up to whoever wants to show up. They don't just say, well, whoever's going to pay my rent is fine. Who's the anchor that's going to attract the other kinds of stores that you want? Who are the other stores, the local stores, the little mom and pops, entrepreneurs? Who are the smaller chains that are appropriate? And what's the mix and how do you do it? And how do you design it so that you have that streetscape that Chris was talking about that's interesting to walk by? And in fact, as you all know, there's studies. We walk at a certain pace. We have a certain very short attention span. We like to see something new every 15, 20 seconds. That means that everything, the storefronts have to be different every X number of feet, so as you walk by. Please, don't put in any surface parking. Whatever you do, surface parking lots are it's like a desert. They're terrible, they're scary, they're awful. Every surface parking lot kills urbanism. You've got to find a way to get street parking is good, because it protects the pedestrians from the cars that are driving by. Off-street parking behind or under or over the stores, whatever it is, expensive as structured parking is. If you've got to do street parking, or if you've got to do parking lots, put them behind the building. So how that parking is handled is extremely important. And housing. Housing is, I think, the key to walkable urban. You've got to have, these places need to be 24/7. You may not have all of your all of the demand for your stores come from the housing there, but you want to have people there 24/7, and you want a lot of it. Everybody underplans the housing, in my view. So if you don't have a market for enough of it to start with, think of phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Keep building more housing, keep building more housing, keep building more housing. Increase the density. As I said, I grew up in Manhattan. There is no limit to the amount of density people can enjoy and what it brings to the liveliness and the vibrancy of the street level life. So it's a mix of all incomes and all ages. Full spectrum housing, in my view, is what we really should be shooting for. It means housing for people of all incomes, and it means housing for people at all stages of our lives. Whether we're kids growing up, whether we're Gen Ys, whether we're in the move-up generation, whether we've got families with 3 or 4 kids, or 1 or 2 kids now, or 1 kid now, seems to be where people are moving to for many of them, or whether you're the early 60s, late 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. We want to have housing for everybody. We want to put them in these areas. So I said transit, office, and jobs are very important services, etc. Clearly, there are a lot of challenges in doing this. I don't need to tell you, so many of you are developers, you're facing these problems. Where do you find the sites? And can you find them at a price that makes any sense, that has any relationship to its real residual value? The costs are high, and that's a problem for trying to provide services and prices for people that are affordable for everybody, and to get the right mix of stores, because frequently I see, even as our little neighborhood in Brooklyn continues to gentrify, we're losing a lot of the stores that really bring the value, that sense of value to our neighborhood. Financing, I don't need to tell you, very, very difficult, very tight. Local opposition, I think what Chris said is right, that people are beginning to understand the value of this urbanism and the value it means to their home, the increased bottom line price of their value of their home. So there are some shifts, but it's still trench warfare out there in most of these sites. Single use and low density zoning. Most of our urban areas, suburban metropolitan areas, have to be totally rezoned, totally replanned. And by the way, we need totally new building codes and parking rules. The parking rules are totally outdated. They're from the 1950s and have to be totally rethought. And we're building far too much parking. Building codes and the whole process has to happen. The process of approvals needs to be radically reformed. Radically reformed. Because it takes far too long to build. For example, if you're building something that this group would approve, if it were me, and I'm a very sensitive environmentalist, I would essentially give you a pass on any environmental approvals, with some basics for water and sewer and things like that. But anything that's smart growth, anything that's walkable urban, is ipso facto should be approved as environmentally sound. But other kinds of approvals too. You should get green tape, you should get to the head of the line, et cetera, et cetera. It takes too long. And there's a lack in many areas, as you know, of community leadership, business leadership, and political leadership. So we need new comp plans, zoning codes, parking rules, government help. Government help, this is where the county governments, the local city governments, town governments can be extremely important. Whether they own the site and are going to sell it to you at the right price meaning the price that will create the kind of mix that we want, or whether somebody else owns the site and they help by helping you acquire it, perhaps on minimum financing, perhaps a lot of different ways that the local government, even if they simply help by planning and zoning around that area so that it becomes the appropriate kind of planning that you need. So local governments have a very, very important role in a variety of ways, and this is obviously where your group or the local district council, ULI district councils around the country can be very important in helping to stimulate that government leadership. Accelerated processing, et cetera, and business partnerships. I think the idea that Chris mentions about the three-legged stool is very important. The local business community, the Chamber of Commerce, should be your ally and should be a partner with you in helping to build these areas, because this is a key to the economic sustainability of these areas, of the counties, of the local areas, etc. So that's what I wanted to say with regard to Chris's comments. So what I'd like to do is take a couple of minutes on a couple of recent events that have occurred. One is what happened earlier this week, the election. Whether you're happy or unhappy about the results, I do think there are a couple of things that are significant with regard to smart growth issues. One is with the continuation of the Obama administration, we're going to continue to have a Department of Housing and Urban Development that understands the importance of regional planning. This is the first time that HUD got it since really back in the 70s, late 70s, when we were starting to do some of the regional planning and supporting that. Well, I don't know that Shelley Petitia's Office of Sustainable Communities is really going to get more money from Congress. The fact that there is this commitment to, on the Department of HUD, to working with the Department of Transportation, working with EPA together, is very important in the long run. And the grants that have been created for sustainable regional planning are very important, not only because they're going to come up with some plans that may or may not be good, we'll see what the plans are, but in many cases, communities that did not get those grants started a conversation amongst groups that had not been talking before with each other that are now continuing. And the whole idea at the regional level of thinking about where do we build, how do we build. I don't know if, how many of you are ULI members or how many of you know about the reality check process, but it's a ULI program that looks at, that helps to give people a chance to envision how they want their region to grow over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Where do you want that development to be? So a lot of this regional thinking is very important because it helps you identify, and not just you as a developer, but it helps the local government, it helps the community leaders understand, those who you're going to need to be your allies, where the development should go, where you want it to go, where the market wants it to go, and how do you balance all of those things. So I think the fact that HUD is going to continue along this process with DOT and EPA is important in and of itself. I don't think there's going to be a lot of money coming down for out of Washington. I think we're going to, the best that we can hope for is to hold on to the amount of housing, affordable housing funds, tax credit funds, CDBG funds, things like that that are coming out of Washington now, but I don't think we're even going to achieve that. I think there's going to be a significant decline in the amount of money coming out of Washington. With regard to other things like the future of housing finance, whether single-family or multifamily, I think it's still very much up in the air. Multifamily, Fannie Mae, FHA, Freddie Mac will continue to provide multifamily financing, I think pretty much in the same way they have been. This says nothing about whether there is going to be a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, but everybody in Washington is pretty clear that those programs are working successfully and need to be preserved. They will, in some fashion. More interesting and more challenging is the question of what's going to happen to single-family finance. We really don't know what the next generation of single-family finance is going to be. We've got to raise $1 trillion or more a year if we're really going to build the amount of single-family housing we need to do. And we've been bringing money in from, obviously, around the world to do that. And that's what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been doing. They will probably not continue as they are now. They may become pure government corporations. They may be combined. There may be a new model where essentially new competitors can be created that are co-ops. In other words, if you want to sell to Fannie or Freddie or to its new partners, you have to become one of the owners, just like a utility co-op. The model also will shift, I think. I think there's a growing consensus that what Fannie and Freddie should do is not buy mortgages anymore. But what they should do is guarantee the securities, mortgage-backed securities. There should be a charge for it, a G fee, and then that should be backed up ultimately by the federal government. How much of the private market for MBSs, single-family MBS, RMBSs, or multifamily CMBSs is going to depend on a number of things. One is it's going to depend on the G fee and the interest rates. So as a G fee, the guarantee fee goes up, charged by Fannie, Freddie, or its whatever follows them. There's more room in the private market to compete. Right now, there's very little room financially for the private market to compete. Plus, there's just not enough transparency, And that's part of what's going to happen, that's going to start coming out of the Dodd-Frank rules. Dodd-Frank will probably not be amended or changed significantly because of the way the election came out. So rules on quality mortgages, QRMs, quality residential mortgage, and quality mortgages. Big issue continues to be what's the amount of the down payment. The idea from a purely conservative point of view that we should have a significant down payment seems kind of obvious after what we've been through, but the truth of the matter is that that the quality of a mortgage is really not solely or that much dependent on the amount of the down payment. If you have a fixed rate mortgage long term, there's a lot of data that shows you there are other factors that are more important in determining whether that mortgage will be successful or not than just the down payment. But that's a big fight that's going to continue, and some point probably this winter we'll start to see what those are. Those mortgages, whatever falls within the QRMs and the QMs, will become the standard. And those mortgages will be less expensive than any other mortgage. And so that's going to determine a lot on how the financing structure is going to be for single-family housing, condo financing, and the like. So watch those very carefully. So will the new Congress address what's happening with Fannie and Freddie? There'll be talk about it, there'll be hearings. Whether they'll be able to come to a consensus on the corporate structure remains to be seen, because there's a big divergence between different views on what should happen with Fannie and Freddie, all the way from they should be eliminated to they should become government corporations. Becoming a government corporation, by the way, is tricky because then they're become part of the appropriation process, and that means they aren't going to get any appropriations. That means they have to survive entirely on their own by charging higher G fees, just the way FHA is having to charge higher insurance fees in order to balance its budget. Not necessarily a bad thing, but remember, we need to stimulate the housing markets, and we need to make sure that housing remains financially affordable. As long as interest rates are where they are now, 4%, 3.5%, this isn't a big issue. But when interest rates go back up to where their long-term norm is 6, 7, 8%, then the difference can be quite significant in terms of affordability. So we've got a very interesting thing where we're restructuring the entire housing finance system, both private and government. We're doing it in the most dysfunctional way we possibly can, with a deeply divided Congress and with people with views, financial views that spread all across the spectrum, and with nobody really knowing the answer and knowing the impact of any of the answers. A lot of studies, a lot of ideas about this, but we're basically groping in the dark. So frankly, from my point of view, the more time we take with it, the better. Just let the system keep going now until the housing markets really come back, and then maybe we can play around and take some risks and see what happens, in my view. One last point, and I just want to touch on what happened a little earlier, which was Hurricane Sandy. There's a lot of debate about Hurricane Sandy that's coming out that's beginning to raise the attention again on climate change. Whether or not Sandy actually was a result of climate change is definitely arguable. It's not a result of climate change. It made it a little bit worse because of it. Clearly, there are more critical weather events that are occurring. But what is known very clearly is that sea levels are rising. Regardless of what you think about climate change, regardless of what you think about causes of climate change, if there is climate change, et cetera, I have my own views on this, and I know there are a lot of people with a lot of different views on this. But it's by now incontrovertible that sea levels are rising, whether you like it or not. And the rate of rise is accelerating. And in fact, the projections made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in 2007 are too conservative. They were based upon a slower level of ocean warming, and they were based than is actually happening. And they were based on a slower level of Greenland ice sheet and Antarctic ice sheet melting than is actually happening. So now the projections are for substantially greater sea level rise this century. And so what that means is whether the storms are worse or less or more or ever, any low-lying area is now more vulnerable. Now, Philadelphia is not on the coast, but you still have plenty of low-lying areas here. And you've got New Jersey, which is one of the most vulnerable places on the eastern seaboard. By the way, the level of sea level rise on the eastern seaboard is higher than the other parts of the country. It's interesting. It rises at different rates in different parts of the country. I don't know why, but it does. And so we now have an issue of how are we going to spend your money, my money, all our taxpayer money, and rebuilding. Now, the first urge in any kind of disaster, and I spent 6 months commuting to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so I have some sense of how people react. First, they go through they go through PTSD right now, and a lot of people in New York and the region are going through that right now. But what they basically want is they want what they had before. Let's just rebuild it. That's what I want. I like it. Let's rebuild it. And of course, that is the most nearsighted, short-sighted thing you could possibly do at this time when we know what we know. There have been so many studies about the New York region, and actually about the regions around the country, in terms of what needs to be done, what the impact is going to be of rising sea levels, and warming temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. So we have it with hosts of recommendations. So what happens now is going to be a lot of tumult in the New York City region about how to rebuild, what big plans do we want, sea gates, are we going to put in marsh areas, what are we going to do? In the meantime, while that is going on, there are a lot of very important, very significant recommendations that can be implemented now without a whole lot of study. I think our job at ULI is to help encourage a lot of these basic kinds of things to be put into place now while people worry about 30-foot high seawalls across the Verrazano Narrows and things like that that are not likely to happen for a long time if they do. What kinds? I'll give you 2 examples. One is I had a chance to ask the Commissioner of Housing for the City of New York whether or not, in considering where they invest in new housing, affordable, mixed income, mixed rate housing, did they consider the evacuation zones and where to put more money? He was very frank. He said, no, we don't. We do make sure that they get flood insurance if they need it, but that's all we do. Well, that just doesn't make sense anymore. Where you build now, so it doesn't mean you don't build, but if you do build in a flood zone, you build differently. You build with resilience. What does that mean? The New York City Building Code, for instance, requires that all boilers and all electrical be in the basement. Moving it up, whether you put it on the roof or whether you put it on the 8th floor, as actually some of the new buildings along the East River in Brooklyn have been doing, and that survived quite well. You put it someplace else. You create, as they have on the East River parks in Brooklyn, you make a flood zone, an area that can flood. You put a park along there, let that flood, allow it to flood, let parks. So don't fight the floods, but just direct the floods, recognize they're going to be. If you're going to be in a flood zone, make the building resilient, recognize that. So there are things now that can be done, that need to be done, and that aren't even going to be as controversial as refusing to allow people to live in the Rockaways, or refusing people to live in Coney Island, or refusing people to live on the barrier islands along the Jersey coast. But we can change, and we can do an ordered retreat from that will take place over the course of the coming century. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure to be here.